Hello and welcome to our new GMOs industry webinar. My name is Maddie Burke with the non-GMO project, and before we get started, I just want to say thank you so much for joining us today. We are excited to hear from our Executive Director, Megan Westgate, on the new GMOs issue, and after our presentation, we'll be conducting a live Q&A session with Megan Westgate and our lead research analyst, Linda Cognato, who monitors the biotech industry daily. So before we get started, I just want to walk through a couple quick housekeeping items and those couple things here. So everyone has entered the webinar in listen-only mode, which means that you are automatically muted, but we still want to hear from you. So at any point during the webinar, if you have a question, please be sure to ask your question in the questions pane, and we'll be monitoring the questions throughout the webinar, and we will have a chance to speak to each of your questions at the end of our presentation in a live Q&A session for just about 10 minutes. If at any point in the webinar you have any issues with tech or anything like that, please feel free to reach out to me over the chat, and I will make sure to respond and try to do as much as I can to support anything that will be happening there. And with that, I'm going to pass it over to Megan.
Thanks, Maddie. Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. Good afternoon, depending where you are. I'm Megan Westgate, Executive Director of the non-GMO project. And as many of you know, we're an independent nonprofit committed to preserving and building our natural non-GMO food supply. In the 15 years that we have been working to protect food transparency and non-GMO choices, I am so proud of what we have been able to accomplish as a community with the support of brands and retailers like all of you. And with how much the GMO landscape is changing right now, your continued commitment is so crucial. So I'm really grateful that you're all here. I have prepared a pre-recorded presentation, so we're going to share that. And then, as Maddie said, we'll be jumping into a live Q&A. So with that, we'll get the presentation queued up. When I started working on the non-GMO project in 2006, there was a real risk of us losing non-GMO genetics for commodities like corn and soy, and consumers were pretty much unaware of GMOs. Fast forward to now, when the non-GMO market is a $40 billion industry, and the butterfly is in every grocery store in the country, and it's easy to think we've got the GMO issue under control. But over the past few years, the biotechnology industry and GMO landscape have evolved really rapidly. There's been an explosion in startup companies using new GMO techniques to create ingredients and products. Genetic engineering is no longer just about a few ag giants manipulating a handful of commodity crops. It's now also about engineering animals and ingredients brewed in vats in warehouses. These techniques, such as RNAi and CRISPR, are easier and less expensive, with faster turnaround from development to product release. Because these new products are created with new genetic engineering techniques, we're also seeing developers basically try to manipulate the market by claiming that the products are non-GMO. This is completely unscientific and inaccurate, and it's causing a lot of confusion. Most importantly, these new GMOs are largely unregulated. Today, we'll take a closer look at each of these aspects. My intent is to alert you to this new GMO landscape because a lot of these products are already entering the supply chain. I want to provide you with the resources to keep your products non-GMO so that you can reliably continue to offer consumers the natural choices they want. When we first started bringing attention to GMOs, we were really just talking about a handful of biotech companies and a few commodity crops, which were basically engineered for just two traits. One, herbicide tolerance, and two, insect resistance. Today, though, we are monitoring over 460 companies developing new GMOs. And that's a nearly 300% increase in just 5 years. So that number just keeps getting higher. And also the purposes for these companies have broadened. So traditionally, we've been concerned with the main cash crops: corn, soy, canola, and cotton. I know you're all familiar with those. These GMOs are transgenic. Transgenic means that DNA from one species is inserted into the genome of another and left there. And these crops have been the GMO poster children of Big Ag. Today, in addition to those traditional transgenic GMOs, new products of gene editing are really changing the biotechnology landscape. Animals are being engineered with human DNA for medical purposes, but then that meat is being approved for human consumption without sufficient clarity on segregation and traceability. Microbes are being engineered to produce a blood-like substance for burgers, which was sold to consumers before the FDA even deemed it safe for humans to eat. Goats are being engineered to produce spider silk for cosmetics, and these examples really are just the tip of the iceberg. GMOs are now entering the market as meat, fruits and veggies, flavorings, colorings, fragrances, dairy proteins, probiotics, plant-based alternatives, cosmetics, body care, silk, vitamins, and lots of other ingredients and inputs. So basically, virtually every grocery aisle is being impacted. There's Brave Robot ice cream, there's the Impossible Burger, and there's Unilever moisturizers in the cosmetics aisle. These products are being made with all kinds of new biotechnology techniques. Those techniques include RNAi, synthetic biology, which you might have also heard referred to as synbio, TALEN, ODM, ZFN, CRISPR. Most of these methods do still involve the use of foreign DNA, but the foreign DNA isn't always left inside the genome, and so that means that the finished products sometimes aren't considered transgenic. And some of the new methods actually don't involve foreign DNA at all. So the technique we've seen the biggest explosion in is synthetic biology, or synbio. In the marketplace, that typically means the engineering of microorganisms in order to create a product, such as a flavoring. By genetically modifying the microbes, what developers are doing is exploiting what the microbes do and essentially turn them into tiny factories. So in that way, those genetically engineered microbes can turn vats of corn into products like sweeteners, vanilla, and collagen, or really just about anything. Because many of the new GMOs are not transgenic, the biotech industry is selling them into the supply chain as non-GMO. They're saying that because they're not transgenic, they're non-GMO. This is both unscientific and it's really out of touch with consumer expectations. What's more is that the US government has largely decided to not regulate most of these new GMOs, and that means that biotech companies don't have to reveal the true nature of what they're selling. Another challenge is that currently there are no commercially available tests to distinguish products of new GMOs, although work is being done on that front. These challenges mean GMOs can easily enter the supply chain unnoticed if we're not united about keeping them out. So what do we know about consumer expectations? Fortunately, against this backdrop, consumers still want non-GMO choices. And it's not just the natural and organic shoppers anymore. In 2019, we conducted an extensive market study with the Linkage research firm, and their results showed that 1 in every 3 shoppers prefers non-GMO choices, and that 64% of all North American shoppers are even willing to pay more for non-GMO options. The Hartman Group found that 65% believe GMO labeling should be mandatory, and the Pew Research Center says that nearly 40% of consumers consider GMOs unsafe to eat. Consumers have always wanted GMO transparency, as many of you know. It's no longer just about knowing what's in their food, though. Based on a recent online survey we conducted, consumer concerns regarding GMOs extend to farmers' rights, food security, social equity, and the loss of biodiversity. New GMOs are largely unregulated, unlabeled, and they're often sold as non-GMO. Yet the bottom line is that consumers are concerned about GMOs, whether the GMOs were grown in a field or grown in a vat. So let's talk about how they're entering the supply chain. Due to the lack of transparency, new GMOs can and are slipping into the food system unnoticed. One example of this came with Impossible Foods. In 2014, Impossible Foods submitted evidence to the FDA for the safety of its heme. Heme is the blood-like substance that makes their burger bleed. And heme is created through the genetic engineering of microorganisms. Again, that's the technique known as synbio. So the FDA allows the companies to self-determine which evidence they want to submit for these reviews, which is obviously concerning in and of itself. But as it was reviewing Impossible Foods paperwork, the FDA actually noticed that the company hadn't examined about 40 proteins in its heme. In 2015, the FDA allowed Impossible Foods to withdraw their petition and resubmit at a later time. Yet in 2016, Impossible decided to go ahead and release its burger to the public via restaurants, allowing consumers to eat it, all the while knowing that the FDA had concerns over those unexamined proteins. At no time did Impossible Foods or the FDA make consumers aware that the product had not yet been recognized as safe to eat. And actually, the public only found out about the FDA's concerns after a watchdog group filed a Freedom of Information Act request, exposing the fact a whole year later. This lack of government oversight has other serious consequences as well. And one is the potential for off-target effects. Off-target effects are unintended or accidental changes made to the DNA during the editing process. So because the companies submit their own safety evaluations, they're usually just focused only on the desired result of the GMO. So they're just looking to see, is the change that they engineered it for happening? And they're not looking for anything else. So that means that if off-target effects happen, they can go unnoticed because neither the company nor the government is looking for them. And that's exactly what happened with Bury the hornless bull. Bury was created in a lab using the gene editing technique Talon to prevent him from growing horns. Bury's maker, Recombinetics, was seeking a development partner, and they reached out to the Brazilian government to together create a whole herd of hornless cows. So Brazil regulates transgenic GMOs, but Bury was supposed to be non-transgenic. In 2018, however, scientists at the FDA were working on a totally unrelated data exercise, and they decided to use the hornless cow's DNA as a test case. Much to their surprise, they discovered some interesting new things in the cow's DNA. During the gene editing process, the cow had accidentally retained a bit of bacterial DNA. Not only was this an off-target effect that the company had missed, but it also now rendered the cow a transgenic GMO and subject to regulation in Brazil. This was an off-target effect that was really caught by total accident. If it hadn't been caught, those cows could have entered the supply chain and their products possibly sold into the food system to unwitting brands and consumers. Off-target effects are just a reality with gene editing because it's imprecise and it can have unpredictable results. In addition to these challenges, the USDA has explicitly stated that it will not regulate new gene editing technologies, saying that they fall outside their scope of review. So that means that brands and consumers have no regulatory agency looking out for them on that front. At the Non-GMO Project, we believe ingredients made from synbio, which is that process that uses genetically engineered microbes, are probably the biggest concern for the natural products industry at this time. Synbio is used to create flavorings like vanilla, as well as colorants, CBD, collagen, plant-based proteins, dairy proteins, vitamins, probiotics. All of these are slipping into the food supply without regulation. and brands are often unaware that they're buying these GMO ingredients. So how do we at the Non-GMO Project know all this? We have a full-time research team that tracks the biotech industry daily. They've created the world's most comprehensive knowledge and database on the development and commercialization of GMOs. We devote an incredible amount of time and effort to this tracking. As you'll recall, it used to be that we were keeping an eye on just a handful of GMO commodity crops. That was a lot easier. Today, we're monitoring all of those 464 biotech companies we mentioned. Our team has a really comprehensive system for tracking the activity of the industry. This flowchart simplifies the process. Basically, our resources include government databases, regulatory data, articles, scientific papers, websites, patents, Security and Exchange Commission filings, monographs, event talks, marketing presentations, investor presentations, legal documents, business profiles, financial reports, and more. We follow the development of new GMOs every step of the way, from inception through trial, promotion, regulatory approval when that's even applicable, and commercialization right up to when they enter the supply chain. Every quarter, the team publishes an internal 350-page biotechnology monitoring report so that we can meticulously track GMOs entering the marketplace, even when they're being sold as non-GMO. And we do all of this to maintain the integrity of our rigorous standard. The research gives brands the confidence that with the butterfly, they can meet consumers' high expectations and maintain their trust. Using the data in this unparalleled biotechnology monitoring research, we know the right questions to ask in our product verification program, or PVP, and what developments to keep an eye on within the biotech industry. And all of that supports our mission to ensure that consumers have true access to non-GMO choices. Let's talk a little bit about the funders. So to really understand the scale of this new GMO landscape, it helps to know who's funding the biotech industry. You have your traditional players like the US government and agrochemical companies. But now there are also a bunch of Silicon Valley venture capitalists who are funding startups, and that's really accelerating the growth of the industry. These include founders from Facebook, PayPal, Google, and the Gates Foundation, and there's also significant foreign investment in biotechnology. And as biotech companies promote their new methods, they're making all kinds of flashy marketing claims about sustainability and co-opting the moral high ground through greenwashing. So for example, Impossible Foods markets its plant-based burgers as sustainable, but its main protein source is traditional commodity crop GMO soy, the monocropping of which obviously harms biodiversity. In addition, big ag either completely ignore or co-opt regenerative practices. But meanwhile, local farmers and producers who are Black, Indigenous, and people of color are totally left out of the conversations. And the ramifications for major food-producing regions, such as those in the global South, are wholly ignored. A lot of these companies are startups that want access to natural and organic consumers, to your shoppers. They're using non-GMO marketing claims to mislead consumers into buying the very technology consumers don't want, GMOs. So the landscape is changing rapidly, and that is why we're watching it so closely. Our expertise allows us to pursue our mission, and it lets us provide you with the confidence you need to know that you're meeting consumer expectations amid this complexity. We're also working hard to keep you informed. So we encourage you to sign up for our new Gmo Alerts Newsletter that we just started a few months ago. Every month it tells you about new GMOs entering the marketplace, including which companies are using them. If you're a brand, know the right questions to ask of your ingredient suppliers. Things like, do you have a GMO avoidance policy? And make sure that you're sourcing from non-GMO project verified suppliers. For this presentation, we put together a web page with educational materials, including a list of questions you can ask and also some words to look out for that can indicate the use of GMOs. So make sure you visit that page afterward. At the same time that many GMOs are slipping into grocery stores without regulation or even awareness, consumers actually increasingly want non-GMO choices. We're committed to providing consumers with the most trustworthy third-party standard for avoiding GMOs. We know that consumers prefer brands that articulate their values and stand for something. To shoppers, the butterfly represents transparency and a better, more natural food system. This remains our mission, and we hope you'll continue to partner with us. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you so much, Megan, for that amazing presentation. And now we're going to transition into our live Q&A session, and we're going to invite Linda Cognato to join us as well. And Linda is our lead research analyst. Hello, Linda. Thank you for being here. Alrighty, so I'm going to read out some questions, and Megan and Linda, you both can take turns responding here. Also, I just want to share for everyone that is all of our attendees and guests, if you have a question that you've kind of been thinking during our presentation, please feel free to ask that question now in the question pane, and we'll do our best to gather that as far as we can and ask as many questions as possible here in the next 10 minutes. Alrighty, so for our first question, I'm going to read this out. What types of products are you seeing from a development standpoint?
I can answer this, Maddie, and thank you. This pretty much goes back to what Megan said in the presentation. We are seeing products today that we've never experienced in the supply chain. There is a lot of movement in terms of creating products using synthetic biology, the genetic modification of microorganisms, and those include animal-free dairy proteins, animal-free egg proteins. We're seeing that human collagen is being produced. There's a plan afoot to actually create honey. So we're seeing products that are brand new in the marketplace.
All right, thank you, Linda. Okay, so next question. Can you remind us what is transgenic?
Sure, transgenic is the merging of more than one species. So in the case of traditional genetically modified crops, a lot of that merging came about through bacteria, the incorporation of bacteria into crop genomes, but it also can take place with the merging of two specific animals. So for example, jellyfish DNA is used in many cases in order to be able to identify whether cells have actually received the genetic change or not.
I'm curious, I'm just wondering now, because I know our audience today is brands and retailers, and I'm wondering how many of you who are on were around back in the day when I was first doing presentations on GMOs and the non-GMO project, and I'm just kind of smiling to myself because the whole focus of those presentations was GMOs were synonymous with transgenics at that point, and then we would go through our list of like, here are the crops, and it's just, I'm still reeling a little bit, even though it's been a few years of getting used to it, of just how much the landscape has changed. And it's just kind of mind-blowing what a different conversation we're having than 10 years ago or even 5 years ago.
Okay, we're getting a lot of questions in here, so thank you all so much for that. I also received a question about, is the recording of this presentation going to be shared? And the answer is yes. We will send a link of this presentation in an email tomorrow, and it will be up on our resources page as well. So we'll put the link for that in the chat. Alrighty, another question here. So what types of GM crops are you monitoring beyond what is on the high risk list?
Well, we also have a lot of crops that we're monitoring that are on our monitored risk list. So that would be Appendix C in the standard. And those are crops that have the potential for some sort of cross-contamination with crops on the high risk list. It also includes crops that we see are being monitored in a significant way or as they approach some sort of commercialization. But there are also crops that we are monitoring that are not on either the high risk or the monitored risk list because they are at the very beginning stages, things like pear and cherry and blackberry. So there are many crops that we've never even had to think about before that are now being genetically modified.
And just to underscore, so what you can see in the published non-GMO project standard, that monitored risk list, as Linda noted, a lot of the reason why we put things on that list are the reasons Linda said, including that just to give industry a heads up of like, these are things that may be moving to the high risk list in some cases. And so that's a place where you can see the things that are closer to commercialization, but there is that 350-page monitoring report that obviously includes a lot more than what's in that appendix of the standard. And there's some sensitivity, I'll just say, around those, like there's a lot of interest we know from industry in seeing all of those details, and we have to be sensitive for liability reasons about some of the details we share, which is challenging, and we're actively working on creative ways of being able to share as much information as we can without incurring undue liability. And that's really because developers are being secretive. And so until and unless developers explicitly own what techniques they're using and how they're doing it, we're having to, as we covered in the presentation, look at a lot of different data sources to piece together pictures. And so we have to be careful about what we say, but there is a lot to keep an eye on.
Great. All righty. Some really great questions coming through here. So I'm going to ask this one. What work is being done on working with the government for improving regulatory oversight?
This is something that we work with other groups on a bit, but honestly, our whole approach with the non-GMO project from the beginning has been to create a market-based approach, largely because the regulatory avenues have been and continue to be relatively discouraging. It's important to keep working with government agencies, but that's not our focus as an organization. We partner with groups who do that. We submit comments when there are open comment periods, and we look for opportunities to influence in appropriate ways. But as we've all seen with where we ended up with the bioengineered food disclosure standard, that kind of confirmed our concerns about what we can hope for from the government when it comes to GMO regulation. I don't know, Linda, if you want to add anything about that.
No, I mean, to some extent, actually addressing government regulations is outside of what I do on a daily basis. I do know that the government has been reluctant to actually regulate GMOs. Even though citizens have taken action and tried to convince the government that it is in their best interest to do so. And as Megan said, we see a lot of that reflected in MBFDS, especially to the extent that it prohibits states from creating their own labeling laws.
And the only review that the only regulatory mechanism that's been in place is through the Plant Pest Act, which is, it's kind of a random, there's never been a regulatory process to address GMOs wholesale, which is why all of these new products that don't necessarily, if they're not crop-based or don't trigger the Plant Pest Act, there really isn't a regulatory mechanism. And I think that reflects the government's lack of interest in really overseeing GMOs.
Great. Okay. Another question here. It looks like we are coming right up to 10:30, so we'll ask this question and we'll see where we're at with timing. So on the list of crops developed, you are tracking, are you seeing any that make claims around carbon sequestration or increased nutrient density?
I'd say yes and no. What I'm seeing the most is not specifically related to crops that are being developed. Certainly there are crops that are being genetically modified to be more drought tolerant. But the big movement on that front is coming in synthetic biology and the genetic modification of microorganisms, which are being modified to create soil amendments, to capture carbon, to actually act as non-chemical fertilizers. There are also being products developed to be applied to roots when plants are put in the ground, or to apply to seeds when they're sown. So we are seeing a lot of movement on that front in synthetic biology.
And I want to weigh in on that and just invite everyone to take a step back and look at, I'm hoping that there will be a growing awareness of how problematic that type of approach is, the urgency that we have to, like, of course we want more nutritious food. Of course we have a climate crisis that we need to address. And I think that in this time of living through all this time of the pandemic and the growing social movements around Black Lives Matter, growing awareness about the importance of really respecting nature and decolonizing ourselves, that from that place of interconnectedness, it's obvious that these are just Band-Aid solutions coming from the same consciousness that created the problems in the first place. And so, while there might be a superficial appeal to some of these approaches, I think what we're certainly seeing in the public consciousness, and we need to make sure that the industry catches up to this, is that there's really a mindset shift required to come back to addressing these problems of how do we truly take care of life on planet Earth? How do we take care of each other as human beings? How do we take care of nature? It's not going to come from these kind of extractive solutions that impose the human concept onto nature in an extractive way.
Okay, thanks, Megan and Linda. So just want to note that it is 10:30 at this point, 10:32, but we do have a couple more really great questions, and we're happy to make some responses to those. So if you need to head out, by all means, thanks so much for joining us, but we'll stay on here to answer just a couple more questions. So I'll lead into our next question here, Megan and Linda, and that is, do we have access to your 350-page biotech monitoring report? If so, how?
Unfortunately, at the moment, you do not. That is an internal document, and for a variety of reasons, some of the liability issues that Megan described before, but also it was never created for outside distribution. So the format is it's created more like a database, so it doesn't provide for easy reading. But what we are trying to do is actually take information that's contained in that document, in that database, and distribute it more widely. So earlier in the year, we created the new GMO alerts, which is one mechanism that we have, the first mechanism for distributing that information to a wider audience. And we also have some other mechanisms in the planning stage that we're considering doing as well for targeted distribution to various stakeholder groups to help keep them informed.
Great.
And examples of that are, like, we've started working on, there's quite a few, like almost a couple dozen, I think, SynBio CBD developers. So that's an example of lists that we're pulling together and looking at how we can share them without, again, incurring undue liability. But it is a treasure trove, so it's a good question, and we are trying to figure out the appropriate ways that we can get more of that information out to you all.
That actually leads really well into another question here. So this question is there a place to find a list of products that use methods like SynBio?
That's an interesting question, and something there currently, to my knowledge, is not. I don't believe there is on the website, but we could certainly compile a list of types of products that rely on or are heavily created these days with synthetic biology, and perhaps even distribute that as a new GMO alert. I'll make a note.
I know also, I think it maybe has been a couple of years since it's been updated, but Friends of the Earth has a paper on synthetic biology that does cover what types of products are commonly developed with that technique.
All right, next question here. Are there any food products that are not a risk from a GMO standpoint?
Well, traditionally, we could say that most crops were not at risk. I mean, certainly there were, papaya for a long time was the only fruit that was at risk of being genetically modified. Now we have apples and pineapple as well. But I'd say that we are seeing more and more development with fruits being genetically modified, and more different types of crops such as lettuce, cress, so things that we've never had to think about in the past. So I'd say across the spectrum, there is more and more interest in creating genetically modified crops. But some of that whether those crops are actually commercialized or not, will depend heavily on whether they're financially viable. And I think that's important to remember in terms of what crops were traditionally released as GMOs. There were large commodity crops. We're also seeing some movement in the combination of what's called pharma and food. And that's food as medicine. So we're seeing the initial development of crops such as tomato. Recently, there was a tomato released in Japan that was modified to help lower blood pressure. So we're seeing this crossover of crops that are being developed in order to create some sort of health benefit that used to be addressed through pharmacology.
But you can check the non-GMO project standard again to see high risk and monitored risk, and if it's not there, then it's what we considered low risk, which is why we have the only things that we consider completely non-risk are things that are not biological in nature, because there is development happening with so many things. And while that's long been the case, you know, that there's been experimental crop development on a number of things, that is, as we've been discussing, accelerating, and the way that the ingredients are being made, you know, of course, is going beyond crops.
All right, I think we'll have time for just 2 more questions here. So first of those is, has GMO cane sugar been fully commercialized in Brazil yet?
To our knowledge, GM cane sugar has not yet been commercialized in Brazil.
It is something that we're tracking really closely because, of course, a lot of the world's sugar does come from Brazil, and we know that there are plans to grow it, and you know, it is moving forward, and it's something that we're looking at very carefully.
Okay, I believe this will be our last question. So does NGP have a list of all the GMO labeling regulations around the world?
No.
We do not have a list of GMO labeling regulations around the world, but we do have a database that tracks GMO regulations around the world. And I would say at this point, we have about 120 countries that we are actually monitoring in terms of their regulations, their labeling requirements, their import and cultivation practices, and as well as the sentiment of their populations in terms of whether they're in favor of or against the introduction of GMOs in the marketplace. A lot of this information is used to inform a compliance pathway in the standard.
And that relates to the previous question about sugar, because when something is commercially produced in GMO form in another country, then it's not eligible for that compliance pathway that Linda mentioned, which relates to the region that it originated. But for things that might be high risk in the US, but maybe aren't grown in GMO form in another country. And Linda, there's like, do you know off the top of your head how many different crops we have on our country of origin tables right now?
Right now, we have almost 1,500 crop country combinations that we are monitoring, actively monitoring on a regular basis.
But that is it for internal use for our product verification program.
Okay, so that's all the questions we have time for. Just thank you so much to everyone who asked these really incredible questions. Apologies if we didn't have time to get to your question, but I just want to share that we'll be sending out a survey in our email tomorrow. We'd love to hear your questions in that survey. please ask away, and we have resources on our resources page. We'll try to answer some of your questions through our educational materials as well. So resources page is in the chat, and we'll send that over email as well. Thank you again so much for joining us, and I'll pass it off to Megan to close us.
I just want to thank everyone for being here, and for many of you being on this journey for 15 years, and it just continues to change and evolve, and I just appreciate everyone's time and attention and your ongoing partnership. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Have a lovely day.